The paper I'll be presenting is Differentiating on Diversity, How Disclosing Workforce Diversity Influences Consumer Choice. This is an EEO-1 form. You might be surprised to learn that every American company with 100 or more employees has been filling this form out since the 1960s. And this form is really neat because it shows the diversity of a company on a very intersectional level, including the number of employees by race, sex, and job categories. But this information is kept private between each company and the federal government, and it's up to companies to voluntarily share this information publicly. Recently, some large companies like Amazon have chosen to publicly disclose this information. And following the Black Lives Matter protests in summer 2020, consumers are asking for more actions from firms towards improving diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of the specific actions consumers and investors have called for is for firms to make transparent their workforce diversity data and publicly share their EEO-1 reports. Since then, we have seen an increasing number of companies publicly disclosing their EEO-1 report data. But if you zoom out just a little, the fraction of companies that disclose this information is still very low. Which leads us to wonder if companies are holding back from publicly disclosing information on their workforce diversity for fear of consumer reactions. In our work, we ask, how does the disclosure of workforce diversity data change consumer attitudes and preferences? And what are these disclosures signaling to consumers? We answer these questions through 5 studies, and in this video, we'll share a few high-level results from a couple of them. We first wanted to examine baseline consumer attitudes when a company chooses to disclose or not disclose their workforce diversity statistics. So we ran an online experiment randomizing people to whether they were exposed to a company that did or did not disclose their workforce diversity. We had 2 different non-disclosure conditions, one which mirrors when consumers are unaware of the EEO-1 and whether the company disclosed or did not. And we had another non-disclosure condition where consumers were aware that the EEO-1 report exists, but the company chose not to disclose. Finally, we had 3 different disclosure conditions reflecting how companies can present their diversity data and what it might reveal about the company. In this disaggregate condition, you can see people of color are overrepresented in lower paying job categories and underrepresented in higher paying job categories. And this data is pulled from Amazon's EEO-1 report, where this pattern of over and underrepresentation of people of color is common across many service-focused companies. In the aggregate disclosure condition, we presented diversity data collapsed across job categories, which makes the company appear quite diverse as this over and underrepresentation pattern is masked. And finally, in the joint disclosure condition, participants were shown both the aggregate and disaggregate disclosures. If we look at consumers' brand attitudes towards these companies, we see that consumers express more positive attitudes towards firms that disclose their workforce diversity data versus firms that do not disclose. So why do people prefer disclosures? And what are these disclosures signaling to consumers? We thought that the company's perceived commitment to DEI might explain people's preferences for workforce diversity disclosures. And we find that people prefer and perceive firms that disclose diverse workforces as more committed to DEI. But what if you're not yet very diverse as an organization? In a follow-up study, we look at how consumers choose to support companies that disclose workforces with different degrees of diversity, this time looking at consumers' choices to support each company. Specifically, we focus on companies that engage in diverse disclosures, non-diverse disclosures where people of color are dramatically over and underrepresented, and companies that do not disclose their workforce diversity data. We asked participants how many raffle tickets they'd like to purchase for gift cards to different companies that engage in each of these 3 types of disclosures, giving us a measure of their choice to support each company based on their disclosure decisions. We find that consumers purchase more raffle tickets, meaning that they are more willing to purchase from and support companies that make diverse disclosures relative to non-diverse disclosures. But even disclosing a non-diverse workforce doesn't hurt relative to concealing this information from consumers and not disclosing this information. To conclude, we find that disclosing workforce diversity data doesn't hurt consumer preferences, especially if you have a diverse workforce. Consumers care about what the workforce diversity data reflects, so organizations should think carefully about improving internal diversity. And finally, disclosures signal a company's commitment to DEI, which consumers value. But there may be other ways to signal this commitment through various initiatives.